I'm Ghislaine Wood. I'm Deputy Director at the Sainsbury's Centre. Welcome to the Visions of Ancient Egypt exhibition, supported by Viking. We're absolutely thrilled that Viking have supported this major exhibition, looking at the enduring appeal of ancient Egypt. The show spans 3,000 years of culture and really explores how Egypt has continued to appeal to artists and designers through time. And we're doing this show now because it marks two very important anniversaries: 100 years since the discovery of Tutankhamun's tomb and 200 years since the decipherment of hieroglyphics by Champollion. So a really important moment to look back and to try and explore why Egypt fascinates people and continues to do so. The exhibition includes over 150 works in all media, and we've borrowed from collections right across the country and outside of the UK. And the first part of the exhibition explores one of the most famous Egyptians, a figure who's come down to us through history in many different guises, but the last pharaoh, Cleopatra. She's been interpreted in many different ways and has come to mean many different things to many different people and cultures. And she's a complex figure. Not a huge amount is known about her historically. She was a Macedonian queen. She was the last pharaoh of Egypt. She was part of the Ptolemy dynasty, which was a dynasty put in place to control Egypt by the Roman Empire. But of course she's best known as a seductress and a great beauty, and perhaps the most famous image of her is Liz Taylor playing her in the great film. But she's meant many different things over time, and in the first part of the exhibition here we explore what Cleopatra, the many faces of Cleopatra, and just adjacent to me here is a wonderful portrait done by Joshua Reynolds in the mid-18th century that looks at a socialite, Kitty Fisher, who is depicting herself as Cleopatra. And there she is, the great beauty, of course pale-skinned, dropping the pearl in the wine, which is one of the most famous sort of stories about Cleopatra. But of course she represented this idea of beauty. Just next to the Reynolds portrait of Kitty Fisher, we have this extraordinary work by the British artist Chris Ofili. This is a work he did while he was at the Royal College of Art, and it disrupts the idea of the Western myth of Cleopatra. She's not a sort of a white erotic beauty, she's a black African queen, done in this raw, rough style. So he's really disrupting the idea of Cleopatra, but he's also reclaiming Cleopatra as a black queen, an African queen. And I think these two portraits show that how Cleopatra can come to represent different things to different people at different moments in time. A number of narratives come down to us about Cleopatra, and of course one of the most famous depictions of Cleopatra is Shakespeare's play Antony and Cleopatra. And this painting from the late 19th century depicts a scene from Antony and Cleopatra, the Battle of Actium, the naval defeat of Antony at the Battle of Actium. And in Shakespeare's play, Cleopatra is depicted as sort of cowardly and leading to the defeat. It was a sort of a moment that was often depicted in art, and here we have it in the late 19th century by an artist called Agnes Pringle. Before the Napoleonic invasion of 1798, artists and designers hadn't really travelled to Egypt. They hadn't really seen the real monuments and documented them. But with the Napoleonic expeditions, where Napoleon went to colonise Egypt, it was a really key sort of geopolitical site, Egypt, and Napoleon really intended to invade and colonise Egypt. And he took with him 150 scholars to sort of document Egypt and to absorb Egyptian culture into sort of French culture. And these scholars, many of them produced important sort of documents that depicted the sites and the monuments of Egypt. So it's a really key moment, but it also shows how Egypt is depicted for sort of colonial purposes. It was very much about absorbing Egypt into French culture, and of course it led to this huge fashion for the Empire style, which adopted and incorporated Egyptian sort of decorative motifs into interior design, highly fashionable interior design in Paris and France in the early 19th century. After the Napoleonic expeditions to Egypt, which really brought the real Egypt to Europe through various different publications that were produced by the scholars that accompanied Napoleon on the Egypt expeditions, after that, travel to Egypt became much more common for artists. And this wonderful work is by the Scottish painter David Roberts, who actually travelled to Egypt in search of new subject matters and also on into the Middle East. And here we see his ruins of the Temple of Comombus, which is a romantic sort of depiction of ancient Egypt, but actually does depict the real temple ruins, and actually does have a more sort of realistic approach to the monuments of Egypt. But of course it is a romantic vision. We see a group of sort of camels and herders and sort of peasants alongside the temple, so to try and give it this sort of sense of realism. But essentially it's a constructed fantasy image, and of course it really adheres to the idea of the sublime, this desert landscape, sort of devoid of vegetation, quite a sort of a brutal environment, but very much looking to this idea of the landscape as a dramatic sort of tableau. From the 1800s, artists are beginning to travel to Egypt. They're beginning to sort of depict the real Egypt, the real Egyptian monuments and sites in watercolour, through photography, through print. So that imagery of Egypt is beginning to disseminate. But alongside that, real Egyptian antiquities and objects are beginning to come back into European museum collections and into private collections. So actually artists now have the opportunity to see real Egyptian objects, even if they haven't travelled to Egypt. And that begins to really affect art and design. A number of painters begin to start incorporating real Egyptian objects, depicting them within their paintings. Although the paintings are still quite sort of fanciful, the objects within them, the material culture within them, is copied from real Egyptian objects. And that's also true for furniture. And here in the exhibition, we're looking at a group of works from the end of the 19th century that really explore how the sort of real objects of Egypt arriving back in sort of European collections are beginning to transform art and design. On the back of this plinth, we can see a painting by Alma Tadema. And Alma Tadema was fascinated by ancient Egypt and did a number of depictions, did a number of paintings that depicted the sort of life and times in ancient Egypt. This work is quite extraordinary in that it depicts a stool form that was actually he had seen in the British Museum collection. So it's an exact copy of a work in the British Museum's collections that had come back from Egypt. That stool was extremely influential. It spawned a whole range of sort of chairs and other furniture forms, stools that were inspired by it, including Liberty producing a range of stools called the Thebes stool, which were produced in a number of sizes in a number of different woods and were very widely available. One of the most wonderful examples is this beautiful chair by the Pre-Raphaelite painter William Holman Hunt, and he also was influenced by seeing this stool in the British Museum and created this chair as a response to it, which takes decorative elements from the Egyptian original piece and kind of makes a replica of them. He also creates this lovely sort of chair form with a sort of lotus decoration on the back. So the sort of materials also evoke Egypt. So at the end of the 19th century, there's this great fashion for sort of replicating Egyptian objects and indeed copying them. And also on this plinth, we see original Egyptian stool, so a lion's paw stool. So these sort of elements that begin to start affecting art and design, creeping into art and design and being seen in the modern interior. If William Holman Hunt's chair is an adaptation of the stool that was in the British Museum's collections, then there was another whole sort of train of furniture being made at this time, a whole strand of furniture being made at this time, which was actually direct replicas of things found in tombs. This wonderful example is a chair based on one found in the tomb of Tuya and Yuya, which was one of the most spectacular tombs discovered before Tutankhamun. So it was a very influential tomb. And it was made by Giuseppe Parvis, who was actually an Egyptian furniture maker working for the Khedive of Egypt amongst many other clients. And he was actually an award-winning sort of furniture maker. And it is an exact replica of a chair found in a tomb. And these kind of works became very fashionable for the modern interior. So alongside the furniture, the replica furniture and the adaptations of Egyptian stools, a number of furniture designers also took a more sort of radical approach. They wanted to sort of incorporate ancient Egyptian forms into sort of modern decorative design, but alongside a number of other sources. And that's beautifully illustrated by this wardrobe by the reformist designer Christopher Dresser. Dresser was really an extraordinary character who sort of drew from many different cultures to create really sort of cutting-edge modern design in the 1880s. And here we see him drawing on Japan, but also on Egyptian forms to create a really sort of startling piece of modern design that would have really been the sort of height of the contemporary in the 1880s. In the mid-19th century, the Great Exhibition provided an opportunity for the masses to come into contact with ancient Egypt. The Crystal Palace had an Egyptian court, and then when the Crystal Palace was moved to Sydenham in 1854, the Egyptian court was expanded, and the designer Owen Jones created this sort of extraordinary Egyptian sort of fantasy space. While it copied sort of real monuments from Egypt, it really evoked the sense of sort of monumentality and the scale of Egyptian sort of sculpture. So it was very, very influential, and it really was this moment where many, many people could sort of engage with Egypt. Alongside that, we begin to get a number of books published from the 1850s onwards that then bring the sort of Egyptian style to a wider audience, and particularly to designers and architects. Christopher Dresser, very important for this too. He publishes his principles of design, decorative design, in 1853, but also Owen Jones's Grammar of Ornament has plates dedicated to Egyptian sort of decorative forms and motifs, so that people can copy these and incorporate them into their interiors. So one of the most important moments in the history of the sort of influence of Egypt is obviously the discovery of Tutankhamun's tomb in 1922. And we're very lucky in the exhibition to have an extraordinary selection of watercolours by Howard Carter, who discovered the tomb. Howard Carter was born in Swatham in Norfolk, so that's a connection to us doing the show here in Norwich. But he was born in 1874 in Swatham to a family of artists, and he was a brilliant watercolourist, and he was taken on by the Amherst family to illustrate their Egyptian collections at Didlington Hall in Norfolk. And that's how he sort of first came in contact with ancient Egypt. And from that, he was then taken on by the British Museum and then the Egyptian Exploration Society to go out to Egypt to document sites. So actually, Carter was in Egypt from the 1890s, from as early as the mid-1890s, early 1890s, depicting the sites of Egypt before colour photography existed. Obviously, having an artist there to illustrate in colour the finds and the sites and the reliefs and the decorations was extremely important. important in terms of the documentation of the site. Howard Carter has a much longer relationship with Egypt than perhaps many people know. He then becomes a member of the Antiquities Service in Egypt and is responsible for several sites until eventually he meets Lord Carnarvon, and working with Lord Carnarvon over several seasons of digging, he excavates a number of different sites before they start on the Valley of the Kings. And famously, Carnarvon had supported Howard Carter on a number of seasons in the Valley of the Kings and had decided to sort of stop and to finish, given that they hadn't had a major find. And it was in the last season that Carnarvon was going to fund digs that Howard Carter found the entrance to the tomb of Tutankhamun in November 1922. And of course, from there, the discovery of the tomb and then the dissemination of the information about the objects coming out of the tomb that created this worldwide craze and spawned what we call Tutmania. If we look at this work, though, this beautiful watercolour, we really see what a gifted artist Howard Carter was. He depicted a number of tombs around along the Nile, and a lot of these watercolours that are in the exhibition haven't really been exhibited before. So the discovery of the tomb precipitated this craze in Europe and indeed around the world for all things Egyptian. An incredible array of objects was being brought out of the tomb and was being photographed by Harry Burton, and then was appearing in the world's press. So the public were very aware of the types of objects that were coming out of the tomb. What happened was this incredible sort of appetite for Egyptian-styled works, and people's daily lives were really sort of transformed from what they wore to the buildings that they went into, to the entertainment that they went to see. Their whole lives were shaped by sort of Tut and by ancient Egypt. So through much of the 20s, we see this craze for Egyptian-style works. And what we're looking at here is a group of fashion pieces. Fashion was one of the areas that was very quick to adopt Egyptian style, and from really shortly after 1922 we see a number of major sort of couture houses in France producing Egyptian style, high-end Egyptian style fashions, which then sort of trickle down into much more sort of popular works. And we have three beautiful works in the exhibition here. We have an evening coat embroidered with Egyptian sort of iconography and motifs. A very elegant work, probably made in Britain, probably in the late 1920s or early 30s, but very typical of this, of the way that sort of Egyptian sort of motifs began to sort of cover all sorts of areas of, you know, whether it was handbags or shoes or coats, became very, very fashionable. I'm particularly fascinated by this dress. This dress is, of course, a straight-seamed flapper dress of the 1920s in the very typical gold and black sort of Art Deco colour scheme. But what's interesting about it is that it's made of Asiut textile. It's made of an Egyptian material. And this was a material that was being made in Egypt from the late 19th century. It's a type of fabric that uses sort of woven metal threads, and it's actually a very, very ancient technique. Materials made with woven metal threads can be found in ancient Egyptian tombs, so it's a very ancient type of fabric. But here we see an Asiut scarf has been adapted into a dress, and the scarf probably would have been sent from Egypt and then made by a European dressmaker into this beautiful flapper dress that is just so archetypally Art Deco. But Egyptian style works also sort of disseminated down into much sort of cheaper objects and materials. And here we see a printed fabric dress, which shows how it really sort of affected all areas of sort of production and design. This is a very beautiful dress which has a sort of repeating pattern with pyramids and palm trees, so it's sort of Egyptian scene. But it shows how Egyptian style could be accessible to a very broad audience through these sort of cheaper materials. So some of the most exquisite things in the exhibition are these two works by Van Cleef & Arpels, the great jewellery company. Like a number of jewellery companies in the 20s, they produced an Egyptian range. Of course, Cartier's range is probably better known, but Van Cleef & Arpels did these absolutely exquisite, highly jewelled pieces that used contrasting gemstones, so emerald, ruby, sapphire and diamond, but incorporated Egyptian sort of motifs. And here we see a flexible bracelet, which was something that they developed in the 1920s, this beautiful lightweight flexible bracelet that would have been worn probably a number of them rather than just one. They were for the very rich. And then this beautiful pin, this belt pin or hat pin, which also has this Egyptian decoration. So many companies, from the very high end right down to the sort of more mass-produced objects, were incorporating Egyptian iconography. So the Art Deco style in Europe really adopted Egypt as part of its sort of its eclectic sources, and we really associate Egypt in the 1920s with Art Deco. A number of companies in Britain were very, very quick to adopt the Egyptian motifs after the discovery of the tomb, and one that was very quick off the mark was Carlsonware, which was a ceramic company in Stoke-on-Trent, and they're very typical of how companies quickly sort of adapted. They were looking at sort of pictures of objects coming out of the tomb, and they were adapting the sort of imagery that they were seeing. And here we see Carlsonware's lovely Tutankhamun range, which was produced from 1923 until 1928. And you can see it's this beautiful sort of royal blue ground with gold transfer printing on top, and gold and other colour enamel work, transfer enamel work. And they are very typical of the kind of objects and sort of products that were being produced, the sort of commercialisation of the Tutankhamun craze. The discovery of the tomb of Tutankhamun coincided with a very important moment in Egypt's own history, Egypt's own striving to become an independent country. And what the exhibition also does is explore the kind of craze for Tutmania in Europe, but also what happened in Egypt, the way that ancient Egyptian sort of imagery and style became the basis for a new modern style in Egypt that really represented this modern nation emerging from sort of colonial rule. So a number of really interesting Egyptian artists begin to incorporate sort of pharaonistic imagery into their work, and particularly a number of sculptors, so Mohammed Mukhtar probably being the most famous. So I think it's important to remember, and hopefully this show illustrates, that ancient Egyptian imagery could mean something very different in Egypt from what it came to mean in Europe.
Hi, I'm Theo Weiss. I'm one of the assistant curators for the exhibition, and behind me is the final section of the show. We're really moving here into the sort of modern and contemporary takes on Egypt, and particularly to Egyptian perspectives on what Egypt and pharaonic Egypt means today to Egyptian society. And so we have a number of Egyptian artists working in sculpture, in film, in textile, photography and painting, who are really digging into this idea of Egypt and what it means today. In this case here are works collected by Robert and Lisa Sainsbury. Now, Robert and Lisa Sainsbury built the Sainsbury Centre that we're in now. They had a number of Egyptian objects in their collection alongside objects from right across the world. This is a small selection of the objects that we have here in the centre, and it really sort of illustrates the fact that they weren't interested necessarily in the monumental, what we associate with Egypt, but much more in the kind of smaller pieces. And what's interesting here also, these pieces were collected from the sort of mainly in the 1950s through to the 1970s. They were doing quite a lot of collecting, especially in the 1970s. And we see in here many pieces that we've seen in the in some of the paintings in earlier galleries. So we see some shabtis, we see this wonderful hippo piece, which unfortunately isn't in any of the paintings, but has become a very iconic piece within the Sainsbury's Centre collection. So we see many of the things that we've seen at scale in some of the paintings in previous galleries, replicated here in the Sainsbury's Centre's own collection. So yeah, behind me is a selection of works by the Egyptian artist Sarah Salam. Sarah is a contemporary artist based in the Netherlands, but who grew up in Cairo. She's really interested in this idea of what ancient pharaonic Egypt means to modern Egyptians like herself. And to explore that, she often looks at collective history through sort of personal histories. In this particular work, which was made between 2016 and 2018, Maha gathers together mementos, images, some of them found, some of them that she has made herself, from kind of family photo albums, some from documents and historic documents to do with ancient Egypt, and she really blends those together. And what she wants to look at is how Egypt has been represented over time, largely from a European perspective to Egyptians, so that their own relation, her own sort of society and her own family's relation to ancient Egypt is one that is really mediated through a view from elsewhere, through a kind of European perspective on Egyptian history. And what she wants to explore is whether there's a way of creating a kind of personal connection with that history, rather than one which is kind of to do with objects in museums or archaeological sites or these great sort of monuments like the one that we see here. So rather than just engage with those monuments directly, she sort of asked, well, how can we make them personal? How can they be things that we can relate to and have emotion, have a kind of emotional connection to? So that's what she's doing here by projecting images of her own grandmother onto these great sort of sweeping monuments in the landscape, and through that trying to think through the kind of connection to the past that her and other Egyptians might be able to create, slightly to readjust and to sort of re-examine their relation to their own historic past. So beside me here are two photographic works by the Ethiopian-American artist Awala Rizku. Awala was born in Addis Ababa in Ethiopia, grew up in the Bronx in New York, and is now based in LA. The two works that we have here are really about exploring what the artist refers to as a diasporic vernacular. So trying to work out what kind of symbols, what kind of objects could be displayed that might capture this idea of a kind of African-American lifestyle, or, you know, trying to find a kind of visual representation of something that he refers to as this sort of diasporic vernacular. So both of these works try and do that by gathering objects, some of them very serious and some of them slightly comical, that are brought together in the style of a 17th century Dutch still life. So slightly tongue-in-cheek in its approach. We have this kind of idea of a gathering of objects where someone's just walked off and left these objects of their life which speak to their kind of daily existence and interests. So we have the still smoking candles. We also have a series of slightly bizarre inclusions like taps and crystal balls. But most importantly, the artist points very definitely to Egypt, and that's particularly clear on the one on the right here, where we have a number of quite iconically Egyptian objects, a bust of the head of Nefertiti, a pharaonic tomb figure with anemes and various symbolic objects, a large cat, which we've seen is something that was long associated with Egypt, and also the head of a crocodile on the very bottom there in the middle. On the left here is doing something slightly different. So the two kind of work in combination, that really Egypt is being introduced as part of the African continent, as an African civilization, which is very much connected to everything south of the Sahara. So in the object, in the photograph here, we have a bust from the Kingdom of Benin in modern-day Nigeria, and also various other objects in both that kind of point, as is present in the rest of the artist's work, to Egypt as an African civilization, but also the importance of both Egypt and sub-Saharan Africa to the kind of diasporic American, African-American identity of today. And that's very present in both of these works. Just beside me here, this very bold, slightly buzzing piece is a large neon sign by the same artist, Awul Arizku. This was created after Arizku spent some time in Hong Kong, and he was really interested in the idea of shop signs and that kind of Hong Kong aesthetic, which we can see in the kind of really glaring neon sign here. What he wanted to explore was how symbols can become kind of global motifs that we see recycled again and again to the point where they become these kind of shop signs. And even just at passing glance, we can recognize the things at their center. So in this instance, that is a head of Nefertiti. This is a bust that was originally from Egypt, now is in a museum in Berlin, and has become a kind of really iconic symbol for a whole load of movements, but particularly for the Afrofuturist movement, and particularly for kind of black political struggles in America. And this is what Awul really is pointing to here in this image. The text at the bottom reads in Chinese characters, Black Power, which is also the name of this particular work. So what Arizku wants to look at in this piece is whether, in becoming these kind of iconic symbols like this Nefertiti bust here, whether these kind of symbols become slightly removed of some of the power that they originally had, or whether they take on a new life as these kind of international symbols that can be recognized, can become part of a shop sign, can become slightly kind of commercialized as they become these kind of iconic motifs. And he really wants to ask what happens in that process, and do pieces and do images like this, symbols kind of lose their power, or do they expand that power as they go outwards? And that's what he's sort of getting at here by this globalized idea of black power, as is written in the text at the bottom, and Nefertiti as this kind of timeless symbol of beauty, but also of kind of political struggle, and some of the politics that's tied up in the original bust that's represented here, which, as I say, is currently stored in a museum in Berlin. And there have been calls for that object to return to Egypt. So there's also a reference to that here in the work. But it's a really stunning piece that kind of grabs you from afar, and as shop signs are supposed to do, brings you in and you know, sells itself, but also raises a whole load of questions.
So that's the end of the tour of Visions of Ancient Egypt. Thanks very much for watching, and I really hope you'll be able to come and see the show. The show's on at the Sainsbury Centre in Norwich until the 1st of January, and after Norwich it travels to the Lane Art Gallery in Newcastle upon Tyne. So I hope you'll be able to catch it in either Norwich or Newcastle next year. I'd really finally like to thank the two main curators of the exhibition, Ben Hinson and Anna Ferrari, who've done such a fantastic job on this fascinating exhibition. Thank you.